Well, given our current situation this semester, I will not be assigning any problems from section 5.2. We're going to skip the majority of it, but I need to give you a couple of things here because you'll need this sort of as background information for the next couple sections. So I'll try to keep this short. In section 5.2, they define an exponential function. So this is what an exponential function looks like, the general form. So a short example, and this is one of the ones I would do in class, would be like this: f of x equals 2 to the x. And so the first half of this section has you looking at graphs of these type of functions. But a real basic one is 2 to the x power. So if we graph this, if we put, for example, if we put a negative 1 in for x, we get a half, okay? So we'd have a point right there in the second quadrant. If we put a 0 in for x, okay? And you could just use your graphing calculator for this. You don't have to graph it by hand like I'm doing here. But if you put a 0 in for x, you get a 1, a y value of 1. Remember, this is interchangeable with y equals. If we put a 1 in for x, we get a 2. 2 to the 1 is 2. If we put a 2 in for x, we get a 4. So what happens with this type of graph is it curves up or down. I mean, we could graph one that curves down, but for this really simple example, this is a exponential function that's curving up and to the right. You'll notice that it never actually gets down to 0. I mean, this y-axis is an asymptote. This x-axis is an asymptote. So this curve gets closer and closer to it. It never touches it. Okay, it never actually gets down to 0. And this thing starts to curve up faster and faster and faster. You keep doubling things, and it's called exponential growth. Okay, this one has a growth rate of 2, so it doubles every time. Okay, so we could graph more of these. You know, we could graph one like this. We could flip it like that. We can translate it. We can shift it up and down. We can stretch it. But the same basic curve shows up. So graphing them is fairly redundant. It's just moving this one basic curve around the graph. And again, you know, if we change this 2 to like a 1/2 x, 1/2 to the x power, you know, the graph ends up getting smaller as you go to the right. It gets cut in half every time. And again, if you remember back from our translation section, we could shift this thing up, down, left, right. We could reflect it, etc. Okay, the only other thing from this section that's sort of critical is the number e. Okay, so here's the definition. You do not have to try to memorize the number e. Okay, you don't have to try to memorize this number, all right? This is just the definition, okay? What you should get comfortable with is finding it on the calculator, okay? The calculator has e in 2 places, all right? So you're looking for a lowercase e. First of all, it's on the divide button, okay? But you have to push second and then the divide button, and you'll get an e to show up. Or it's also on the ln button, but this one has e to the x on it. So at some point in your life, you would have accepted that pi was just a number. Pi, most of us remembers pi is 3.14. But what most people don't remember is the definition for pi. Like this one, e has a definition. This is the definition for e. So if you put a really big number in for n, you're going to get the value of e, is what this definition is saying. I'm not asking you to memorize that at all, okay? Just like no one ever probably asked you to memorize the definition for pi. At a certain point in your life, you just accepted that pi was 3.14. And so what I'm asking you today to do is to accept the fact that E is 2.718. Okay, so take a minute to mess around with your calculator, clear off your screen, type second, and then the divide button, and your E should show up. Okay, and then push enter, and you should get 2.718. So, the one thing, the last thing that I'll mention here, I guess, about E is it is just a number. E is a number, just like pi is a number. You can add it, you can subtract it, you can divide by it. It's 2.718. Okay, so find it on your calculator and accept the fact that E is 2.718.